The town of Oak Haven was usually the kind of place where nothing ever happened. The biggest news in a week might be a prize-winning pumpkin at the county fair or a new stop sign going up at the busy intersection. But lately, the quiet little town had turned upside down. It felt like the entire world had parked its cars on the main street and set up camp, all waiting for the same thing. They were waiting for the trial of Arthur Henderson. Arthur was not just anybody in Oak Haven. He was the kind of man people pointed to when they talked about success. He owned the biggest factory in the county, the one that made parts for cars and employed half the town. He lived in the big white house on the hill, the one with the perfectly cut hedges and the fountain in the front yard. Everyone knew the Hendersons. They were the picture-perfect family. They went to church every Sunday. They donated money to the hospital. They smiled and waved during the town parades. If you looked up the word respectable in the dictionary, you would probably see a picture of Arthur and his wife, Eleanor, but now Arthur was sitting in a courtroom, and the picture was cracked. The charges against him were serious. The government said that Arthur had stolen millions of dollars. Not just stolen, but hidden it away in secret accounts while the charity he ran slowly went broke. It was a strange, confusing story about numbers and wires and foreign banks. Most people in town didn't understand all the details. They just knew that their hero was accused of being a thief. The news trucks were parked outside the courthouse 24 hours a day. Reporters with microphones and cameras were everywhere, trying to catch a glimpse of the family that had fallen from grace inside the courtroom. The air was always cool and smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax. The judge sat high up on his bench, looking down at everyone like a strict principal watching over a school. The lawyers in their fancy suits walked back and forth, shuffling papers and whispering to each other. But the real drama was happening at the front table where the Henderson family sat. Arthur looked tired. His face was pale, and he had lost weight since the trial started. He kept his jacket buttoned tight and his back straight, trying to look like a man who was confident he would win. Next to him sat his wife, Eleanor. She was a thin, elegant woman who always wore her hair in a perfect twist. Every day, she carried a small white handkerchief and a rosary. She would dab her eyes every time the prosecutor said something mean about her husband. To the people watching in the gallery, she looked like a saint suffering through a nightmare. Then there was Leo. Leo was 16 years old. He sat in a chair right behind his parents, slumped down so far that he looked like he was trying to disappear inside the wood. While his mother cried and his father looked angry, Leo just looked at the floor. He wore a dark suit that was slightly too big for him, making him look younger and smaller than he actually was. His hair was messy, falling over his eyes, shielding him from the staring crowds. The court was packed. People lined the benches, craning their necks to see the boy whose father had let everyone down. The news cameras couldn't film inside the room. But the sketch artist sat in the back, drawing fast pictures of Leo's sad face. Everyone felt sorry for him. The newspapers called him the forgotten victim. The town whispered about how hard it must be for a teenager to watch his father be torn apart by the law. They saw a broken boy, a shy kid who was traumatized by the collapse of his family. But they didn't see the real Leo. If anyone had taken the time to really look at him, instead of just pitying him, they might have noticed something strange. Leo wasn't shaking because he was scared. His hands were clenched into tight fists in his lap, digging his nails into his palms until they turned white. When he looked up, his eyes weren't full of tears. They were dry and hard, burning with a quiet, intense fire. He wasn't looking at his father with love, and he wasn't looking at the judge with fear. He was watching everything like a hawk, storing every word, every lie, and every movement in his memory. On this particular morning, the defense attorney was speaking. He was a loud, confident man with a booming voice that filled the room. He was telling the jury a story. He was painting Arthur Henderson not as a thief, but as a hero. He talked about the jobs Arthur had created. He talked about the checks Arthur had written to help sick children. He told the jury that the missing money wasn't stolen. It was just a mistake made by accountants who didn't understand Arthur's grand vision. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lawyer said, spreading his arms wide, "Arthur Henderson is a builder. He builds things. He builds factories. He builds businesses. and he built this community. To say he stole from the very people he tried to help is not just wrong, it is a tragedy. The lawyer paused for effect, looking dramatically at Arthur. Arthur put a hand over his heart, nodding slowly, looking like a brave soldier accepting a medal. Then the lawyer turned toward Leo. "And what about the cost to his own flesh and blood?" the lawyer asked, his voice softening to a whisper. "Look at that poor boy up there. He has had to watch as people drag his father's name through the mud. The stress has nearly destroyed him." Eleanor let out a loud sob at that moment, pressing her handkerchief to her face. It was perfect timing. It looked exactly like a mother's heart breaking. The people in the courtroom sighed softly, feeling a wave of sympathy for the poor family. Leo sat perfectly still. He didn't move a muscle. He watched his mother cry, and a cold feeling washed over him. He knew it was an act. He knew she wasn't crying for her husband, and she certainly wasn't crying for him. It was all part of the show. For years, Leo had lived in a house that was really just a stage set. The big dinners, the friendly waves, the donations, they were all props. Behind the closed doors of that big white house, the air was always heavy. There was no laughter in the hallways, only shouting and the sound of heavy footsteps. The charity money that the lawyers were talking about wasn't a mistake. Leo knew exactly where the money went, or at least, he knew where some of it went. He knew about the late-night meetings in the basement, the men in suits who wouldn't make eye contact, and the locked drawer in his father's desk that Leo was never allowed to touch. The trial was in its third week, and the tension was getting worse. At night, the house felt like a cage. His parents didn't talk about the case in front of him, but he could hear them arguing through the thin walls of his bedroom. "They're getting too close." Arthur Eleanor would hiss, her voice sharp and hard. Completely different from the weeping woman in the courtroom. "You need to make sure the boy knows what to say." "Leave him out of this," Arthur would snap back. "I am not leaving him out of it. He is the only card we have left if the numbers don't add up," she would reply. Leo would lie in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to it all. They weren't worried about going to jail because they were innocent. They were worried about getting caught. And now they were planning to use him to get out of it. The defense team had told the judge that they might call Leo to the witness stand. They wanted him to tell the jury what a wonderful father Arthur was. They wanted him to cry and lie, just like his mother was doing. Leo felt trapped. He had kept his mouth shut for years because he was scared. He was a kid, and they were the adults with all the power. They told him that family was everything, that you never turn your back on your own blood. But sitting there in the courtroom, watching his father lie so smoothly to the jury, Leo felt something change inside him. The fear was turning into something else. It was a heavy, solid feeling in his chest. He looked at the back of his father's head. He watched the way Arthur confidently whispered to his lawyer. Leo knew the truth. It wasn't just about money. It was about something much darker, something that had made Leo's life a living hell for years. The stolen money was just the tip of the iceberg. The real secret, the ugly thing that lived in their basement, was the thing they were desperate to hide. The judge announced a break for lunch. The people in the gallery stood up, stretching their legs and buzzing with conversation about the lawyer's speech. "He might actually get off," one man whispered to another. "It's just numbers," and they found a doubt. Leo stood up slowly. He didn't join the conversation. He walked out of the courtroom between his parents, walking like a prisoner escorted by guards. As they stepped into the bright hallway, blinded by the flashing cameras of the waiting press, Arthur leaned down close to Leo's ear. "Keep your head up," Arthur whispered, smiling for the cameras while squeezing Leo's arm hard enough to hurt. "We win this next week. You just do what you're told, and this all goes away." Leo looked up at him. For a second, the cameras clicked and the lights flashed, capturing what looked like a father comforting his son. But Leo didn't look comforted. He looked straight into his father's eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look away. He didn't nod. He didn't agree. He just stood there, silent and defiant, holding on to a secret that was about to blow the roof off the entire courthouse. The atmosphere inside the big white house on the hill had changed completely. Before the trial started, the house was always busy. filled with the sounds of caterers and gardeners getting ready for parties. Now it felt like a tomb. The thick velvet curtains were drawn tight to keep the reporters and their cameras from peeking inside. The only light that came into the living room was a dusty gray beam that managed to slip through a crack in the drapes, illuminating the floating dust. For the past 3 weeks, this room had become a war room. It wasn't a place where family lived anymore. It was where the defense team lived. There were stacks of paper everywhere, covering the expensive mahogany tables and the floor. Legal pads, thick folders, and empty coffee cups littered every surface. The air smelled of stale coffee and old pizza. Mixed with the heavy scent of Eleanor's perfume, Leo sat on the edge of the stiff sofa, his back aching from sitting in the same position for hours. He was surrounded by adults in suits who were shouting over each other. They were arguing about bank transfers and dates, using words that Leo didn't fully understand, but knew were important. His father, Arthur, sat in his leather armchair, looking like a king holding court. He seemed to feed on the chaos. The lead lawyer, a man with a red face and sweaty forehead, suddenly pointed a finger at Leo. "It's not enough," the lawyer shouted. "The numbers are confusing the jury. We need to humanize this case. We need to show them Arthur is a father, not just a businessman. We need the boy." The room went quiet. All eyes turned to Leo. He felt small under their gaze, like a bug under a microscope. His father stopped tapping his pen on the table and looked over. "He's ready," Arthur said calmly. "Aren't you, Leo?" It wasn't really a question. It was a command. Leo nodded slowly, even though his stomach felt like it was tied in a giant knot. They had decided that Leo was going to take the witness stand. The plan was simple. Leo was supposed to get up there, look sad and innocent, and tell the jury stories about his father. Stories about teaching him to ride a bike or helping him with homework. They wanted to trick the jury into thinking that a man who loves his son couldn't possibly be a criminal. For the next 2 days, the coaching began. It was intense and exhausting. The lawyers made Leo practice over and over again. They told him exactly how to sit, how to speak, and even how to look at his father when he was pretending to get emotional. Look at him with love. Leo, the lawyer instructed during a practice session in the dining room. "When you talk about the charity work, look at your dad like he is a hero. You need to sell it." Leo tried to do what they asked. He rehearsed the lines until his throat was dry. "My dad always taught us to help people," Leo would say, trying to make his voice sound soft and sincere. But every time he said the words, he felt a wave of nausea. It was all a lie. His father never taught them to help people. His father taught them to take whatever they wanted. The pressure inside the house was getting worse. The trial was going into its final week, and the defense was desperate. They knew the prosecution had strong evidence. They knew they needed a miracle, and that miracle was Leo. That night, the house was finally quiet. The lawyers had packed up their briefcases and left for the evening. Leo was in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed with the lights off. He was staring at a small silver USB drive that he held tightly in his hand. He had taken it from the hidden drawer in the basement months ago. It was his insurance policy, the one thing that kept him from completely losing his mind. It held the truth about what the family really did in the dark. Suddenly, his bedroom door opened without a knock. The light from the hallway flooded in, silhouetting his father's large frame. Arthur didn't turn on the light in Leo's room. He just walked in and closed the door behind him, plunging them back into the shadows. "You need some sleep, Leo," Arthur said. His voice was low and smooth, completely different from the loud, angry tone he used with the lawyers. "You look tired." "I'm fine," Leo whispered, clutching the USB drive tighter and sliding it under his pillow. Arthur walked over to the bed. He didn't sit down. He stood over Leo, looking down at him. Even in the dark, Leo could feel the heavy weight of his presence. "The lawyers tell me you're doing a good job with the testimony," Arthur said. He leaned one hand on the wall, trapping Leo in the corner. "But tomorrow, when we do the final run-through, you need to be better. You need to be more convincing. The jury needs to believe you." Leo looked up at the shadowy figure of his father. "I'm trying," he said. "Trying isn't good enough," Arthur snapped. The charm vanished instantly. His voice turned hard, like ice. "You listen to me, Leo. Everything we have, this house, your school, Your future, it all depends on what happens in that courtroom. If you mess this up, if you say one wrong word, you aren't just hurting me. You are hurting your mother. You are hurting yourself. Arthur leaned closer, his face inches from Leo's. Do you remember what we talked about? Family secrets stay in the family. There are people watching us, waiting for us to slip up. If you tell them anything other than what we practiced, I will make sure you have nothing. Do you understand? Leo nodded, his heart pounding in his chest, so loud he was sure his father could hear it. He wanted to scream. He wanted to pull the USB drive out from under his pillow and throw it at him. But he was scared. Arthur was a powerful man, and right now, Leo was just a 16-year-old boy with nowhere to go. Good, Arthur said, his voice softening again. Now get some sleep. We have a big day tomorrow. Arthur turned and walked out of the room, closing the door firmly behind him. Leo sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the silence. He heard the faint creak of the floorboards as his father walked down the hall to his own room. A few minutes later, Leo heard the door open again. He thought his father had come back. He held his breath. But then he saw the silhouette of his mother, Eleanor. She stepped into the room, her perfume drifting in before her. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, looking at Leo. For a second, Leo thought she was coming to check on him, maybe to tuck him in like she used to do when he was little. But she wasn't looking at him with love. She was looking at him with cold, calculating eyes. Your father is stressed, she said quietly. Don't make it worse. I'm not doing anything, Leo whispered. Just stick to the script, she said sharply. Don't get any ideas about being a hero. Heroes end up with nothing, Leo. Remember that. She turned and left, leaving the door slightly ajar. Leo sat frozen on his bed. He realized then that he was truly alone. His parents were a team, a unit built on greed and lies. They viewed him not as a son, but as a tool. They didn't care if he was scared. They didn't care if he was lying. They just needed him to perform. The anger that had been building up inside him for years suddenly felt too big to contain. It burned in his chest. He looked around his room at the expensive trophies and gadgets his parents had bought him over the years. None of it meant anything. It was all just hush money. Gifts to keep him quiet and happy. He stood up and walked over to his window. He carefully pulled the curtain back just an inch. Down below, on the street, he could see the parked news van. The reporter was sitting inside, typing on a laptop. They were all waiting for the trial to end. They were all waiting to see if Arthur Henderson would go to jail for stealing money. They had no idea what was really going on. They thought this was a case about embezzlement. They thought the Hendersons were just a greedy family trying to get richer. They didn't know about the threats, the fear, and the hidden ledger on the USB drive in Leo's hand. Leo looked at the screen on his laptop one last time. He had opened the files earlier that day. He saw the names, the dates, and the amounts. It was terrifying. If he showed this to the world, it wouldn't just send his parents to jail for a few years. It would destroy them completely. It would ruin lives. But if he didn't do it, he would be trapped forever. He would grow up to be just like them, living a lie, always afraid of the dark. He sat back down on the bed and took a deep breath. He thought about his father standing over him, threatening him. He thought about his mother standing in the doorway, warning him. They thought they had him under control. They thought they owned him. Leo put the USB drive into his pocket. He made his decision. He wasn't going to be their puppet anymore. He was going to testify in 2 days. He was going to walk into that courtroom, and he was going to tell the truth. He didn't know exactly how he was going to do it yet. But he knew one thing for sure. The gasps he heard from the crowd on that day wouldn't be for his father. They would be for the truth. And that truth was going to burn the house down. The morning air in Oak Haven was crisp, but inside the courthouse, it felt like a sauna. The tension was so thick, you could almost touch it. Today was the day. The hallway outside the main courtroom was packed with reporters rushing to grab their spots, photographers adjusting their lenses, and curious townspeople hoping to catch a glimpse of the Henderson family. Everyone knew the schedule. Today was the day Leo was going to take the stand. The defense team was confident. They had spent hours drilling Leo, making sure he knew his lines perfectly. They believed that if the jury saw this poor, heartbroken boy defend his father, they would never convict Arthur. In their minds, Leo was their secret weapon. They thought they had him completely under control. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. The judge had not yet taken his seat, so the room was buzzing with low murmurs. Arthur sat at the defense table, looking calm and collected. He wore a crisp blue suit that made him look trustworthy and professional. Beside him, Eleanor sat, clutching her rosary beads so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked every bit the worried mother. Leo sat in the chair directly behind them. He felt like he was sitting on an anthill. He couldn't stop moving. His legs were bouncing up and down, and his hands were sweating so much he had to keep wiping them on his pants. Every time a door opened, he jumped a little. He wasn't just nervous. He was terrified. But underneath the fear was a strange sense of calm. He had made his decision. He knew what he had to do. "All rise," the bailiff shouted. The room instantly went silent as everyone stood up. The judge walked in and sat down, adjusting his glasses. He looked at the lawyers. "The defense may call its next witness." The defense attorney stood up, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. He looked like a man who had already won. "The defense calls Leo Henderson." Leo felt his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy like lead weights. He walked past his parents. His father didn't look at him, but he nodded slightly, a signal to stick to the plan. His mother didn't look up at all. She just stared at her hands. Leo walked to the witness stand. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. The words rang in his ears. The whole truth. He sat down in the leather chair, which swiveled slightly. The lights were bright in his eyes, making it hard to see the faces of the jury. But he could feel their eyes on him. They were waiting. The defense attorney walked over to the stand, giving Leo a warm, fatherly smile. It was the same smile he had used during the practice sessions in the dining room. "Leo," the lawyer began, his voice soft and gentle. "You're 16 years old, is that correct?" "Yes," Leo answered. His voice cracked a little. "And you love your father very much, don't you?" the lawyer asked. Leo looked over at Arthur. Arthur was looking at him with intense eyes, daring him to mess up. Leo thought about the threats, the arguments, and the fear. He looked back at the lawyer. "I used to," Leo said quietly. The lawyer paused for a second, blinking, but he didn't panic. He assumed Leo was just acting traumatized. "I know this has been hard," the lawyer continued sympathetically. "Can you tell the jury about a time when your father helped you? Maybe a time when he taught you something important?" This was the rehearsed part. Leo took a deep breath. He was supposed to talk about learning to drive. Instead, he looked down at his hands. "My father is a busy man," Leo said slowly. "He didn't really have time to teach me things. He had people for that." The lawyer frowned slightly. "Well, surely he spent time with you? Maybe on weekends?" "He spent time in his office," Leo said, his voice getting a little stronger. "Or in the basement." The room went very still. The lawyer tried to steer Leo back to the script. "Let's talk about your father's work. He worked very hard to provide for this family, didn't he?" "Yes," Leo said. "He worked hard, but not the way you think he did." The lawyer cleared his throat. He was starting to sweat. "I mean, tell us, did your father ever bring charity work home? Did he ever talk about the good things he was doing?" Leo looked up. He looked directly at the jury. "He talked about money," Leo said. "He talked about power, but he didn't get that money from working hard. He got it from scaring people." The defense lawyer's eyes went wide. "Your Honor," he interrupted, I need a moment." The judge looked over his glasses. "Proceed, Mr. Henderson." The lawyer tried again, his voice sounding a bit shaky now. "Leo, are you feeling okay? You seem confused." "We talked about how your father was a good man," no, Leo said. "You talked about it. You told me what to say. But I'm done listening to you." Low murmur started in the courtroom. People were leaning forward. Arthur Henderson's face was turning red. He looked like he wanted to jump out of his chair, but he stayed frozen. Eleanor was covering her mouth with her handkerchief, but this time she wasn't crying. She was shaking. The lawyer realized he was losing control. He decided to sit down quickly before Leo did any more damage. "No further questions," he mumbled. He practically ran back to his seat. It was the prosecutor's turn. The prosecutor was a woman with sharp eyes and gray hair pulled back into a bun. She didn't rush. She walked slowly to the stand, watching Leo the whole time. She didn't know what was going to happen, but she could smell blood in the water. "Leo," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you mentioned the basement just now. What happens in the basement?" Leo took a deep breath. This was the moment. The point of no return. He glanced at his father one last time. Arthur looked terrifying. He was mouthing the word stop, but Leo didn't listen. "The basement is where the real office is," Leo said. "The office upstairs is just for show. In the basement, there are computers." "Lots of them. Computers for what?" the prosecutor asked. "For blackmail," Leo said clearly. The word hung in the air like a bomb going off. "Blackmail?" the prosecutor asked, acting surprised, even though her eyes were shining with intensity. "Yes," Leo said. "My father didn't just steal money from the charity. That was just the start. He used the charity to find out secrets about people. Rich people, politicians, judges. If they donated money, he would dig up dirt on them. And if they tried to stop him, he would threaten to release it." The courtroom exploded into noise. People were gasping, shouting, and jumping up. The judge slammed his gavel down hard, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. "Order. I will have order in this court." Arthur stood up. "This is ridiculous," he yelled. "The boy is lying. He's disturbed. Sit down, Mr. Henderson." The judge roared, pointing the gavel at him. Arthur hesitated, then fell back into his chair, breathing hard. The prosecutor turned back to Leo, ignoring the chaos. She spoke quietly, forcing everyone to listen. "Leo, how do you know this?" "Because I saw it," Leo said. "And I have the files." The room went silent again. Dead silent. "What files?" the prosecutor asked. Leo reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of the USB drive he had carried with him every day for the last month. He pulled it out and held it up. It was small, glinting under the courtroom lights. "I made a copy of his hard drive," Leo said. "Before the police took his computers, I copied everything. It's all on here. The names, the payments, the threats." He looked at his mother. She was staring at him with pure hate in her eyes. It hurt, but it didn't stop him. "And my mother," Leo said, his voice trembling but loud. "She knew. She handled the books. She knew where every cent came from." Lenore let out a low wail and collapsed onto the table, burying her head in her arms. Arthur looked like he had been punched in the gut. For the first time in the entire trial, he looked defeated. The confident mask was gone. He looked like an old, scared man. The judge looked at the USB drive in Leo's hand. He looked at the prosecutor. "Counsel," the judge said, "do you wish to enter this item into evidence?" "We do, Your Honor," she said, smiling slightly. Leo placed the drive on the rail in front of him. As he let go of it, he felt an incredible weight lift off his shoulders. He sat back in the chair. The witness stand that had felt like a cage just moments ago suddenly felt like a stage. He had done it. He had broken the silence. The town of Oakhaven would never look at the Henderson family the same way again. He was no longer the victim. He was the witness who had brought down the house. For a few seconds, after Leo let go of the USB drive, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. It felt like the entire world had stopped to take a breath. Then the silence shattered. It wasn't a slow murmur this time. It was a roar of noise. Reporters in the gallery were scrambling over each other, shouting questions and trying to get a closer look at the small silver drive resting on the wooden rail. The sound of camera shutters clicking outside. The open doors was like a swarm of locusts. The judge was banging his gavel again and again, shouting for order, but his voice was drowning in the chaos. The deputies stationed near the front looked tense, their hands resting on their belts as they watched the angry crowd. In the middle of all this noise, Leo sat perfectly still. He felt strange. He expected to feel scared knowing that he had just destroyed his family's name, but instead he felt light. Like he had been carrying a boulder on his back for years, and suddenly it was gone. He watched his father. Arthur was no longer the calm, confident businessman. He had jumped up from his chair, his face turning a dark shade of purple. He was pointing a shaking finger at Leo, his mouth opening and closing, but no words were coming out at first. Finally, he found his voice. "You liar!" Arthur screamed, his voice cracking. "You ungrateful little liar. He's crazy. He's been plotting this for attention." The judge slammed his gavel down so hard the handle cracked. "Mr. Henderson, sit down immediately, or I will have you held in contempt," the judge bellowed, standing up himself. "If you do not control yourself, you will be removed from this courtroom." Two deputies moved toward Arthur, looking ready to grab him. Arthur looked around wildly, seeing the angry faces of the jury and the stunned look of his own lawyer. Slowly, he sank back into his chair, but he didn't stop staring at Leo. It was a look of pure hate. It was the look a wolf gives a sheep that has turned around and bit it. But Leo didn't look away. He just looked back, tired and sad. Beside Arthur, Eleanor was not screaming. She was slumped over the table, weeping into her arms. But they weren't the soft tears of a grieving mother anymore. They were the loud, ugly sobs of someone who has lost the game. She knew the USB drive held the records, the secret book she kept in the bottom of her jewelry box. She knew there was no talking her way out of this. The prosecutor walked over to the witness stand with a plastic evidence bag. She carefully picked up the USB drive and placed it inside, sealing it shut. She held it up for the jury to see. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "the prosecution requests a recess to examine this evidence. I believe this drive contains the missing links we have been searching for." The defense attorney stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked like a man who had just realized he was on a sinking ship. "Objection. We don't know what is on that drive. It could be fake. It could be a video game for all we know. This is highly irregular." "Overruled," the judge said firmly. "Given the witness's statement and the reaction of the defendant, I am granting a recess until tomorrow morning. We will have forensic experts analyze the drive tonight. Mr. Henderson, under no circumstances are you to approach your son. Bail is revoked pending this new evidence. You will be taken into custody." The word custody hung in the air like a heavy stone. Arthur looked horrified. He wasn't going home to his big house tonight. He was going to a jail cell. As the deputies came to take Arthur away, he struggled. "I'm innocent. You can't do this," he shouted as they grabbed his arms and handcuffed him. The click of the metal cuffs was the loudest sound in the room. As they dragged him toward the side door, Arthur twisted his neck one last time to look at Leo. "You think you're free?" Arthur spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You're nothing without us. You'll never be anything." Leo just watched him go. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The truth was already doing the talking. Eleanor was left sitting alone at the table. The deputies didn't handcuff her yet, but they told her she wasn't leaving either. She looked up, her makeup running down her face in black streaks. When she looked at Leo, it wasn't with hate. It was with a desperate, pleading look. She mouthed the words, "Why?" But Leo just turned his head away. He couldn't look at her anymore. The betrayal was too deep. Leo was allowed to leave the courtroom. As he stepped out into the hallway, the wall of reporters rushed him, shouting questions. "Leo, is it true your father blackmailed people?" "Leo, what's on the drive?" "Leo, how long have you had this?" He felt like a small boat in a storm. Two social workers from the court stepped in front of him, acting like human shields. They ushered him through a side exit, away from the cameras and the noise. They took him to a small private room down the hall, where it was quiet. For the next hour, Leo sat there with a police officer and a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, who was a victim advocate. She brought him a cup of water and sat with him. She didn't ask him about the case. She just asked him if he was okay. I feel dizzy, Leo admitted, but in a good way. Mrs. Gable smiled gently. You were very brave, Leo. I know that couldn't have been easy, wasn't he said. But it was necessary. Outside the room, the wheels of justice were spinning furiously. The USB drive was flown to a state police lab under heavy guard. Top computer experts spent the entire night tearing it apart. What they found was worse than even Leo had described. There wasn't just one blackmail ledger. There were thousands of emails. There were voice recordings of Arthur threatening people in his own smooth, scary voice. There were photos, bank statements showing millions in payoffs, and detailed notes written by Eleanor about who paid and how much. By morning, the news was everywhere. The headline on every newspaper and website screamed about the House of Horrors in Oak Haven. People who had been afraid of Arthur for years started coming forward. One city councilman admitted he voted for a zoning law because Arthur threatened to release photos of a gambling debt. A local business owner confessed he had been paying Arthur for years to keep a secret about a fire in his warehouse. Years ago, the web was much bigger than anyone thought. It wasn't just about stealing charity money. The Hendersons had run the town like their own personal mafia. When court resumed the next day, the mood was completely different. The judge looked exhausted, but resolute. The prosecutor entered with a stack of new files so big she had to use a cart to wheel them in. The defense lawyer looked like he hadn't slept all night. He approached the bench before the jury came in. Your Honor, he said quietly, based on the new evidence provided by the state, my client wishes to change his plea. He pleads guilty. The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor, to all charges. We are waiving a trial on the new charges. We just want to make a deal. The gasps that went through the room were loud, but they weren't gasps of sympathy. They were gasps of shock and vindication. Arthur Henderson, the man who never lost, had surrendered. Leo was brought back into the courtroom for the hearing. He didn't have to sit in the witness stand this time. He sat in the back row, watching. He watched as Arthur stood up, dressed in a jail uniform now, looking smaller and older than he had a week ago. Arthur spoke into the microphone, admitting his crimes. He admitted to the fraud, the theft, and yes, the blackmail. But he didn't look at Leo. He couldn't face him. When it was over, the judge set a sentencing date for the following month, reminding them that they would likely spend the rest of their lives in prison. As the court adjourned, Leo stood up. He walked out of the courtroom, but this time, he didn't sneak out the side door. He walked down the main steps of the courthouse. The sun was shining bright. The cameras were flashing again, and the reporters were shouting, but it sounded different now. They weren't shouting at him with anger. They were shouting his name in respect. A few people in the crowd started to clap. It was slow at first, just one person, then two, then 10. Soon a wave of applause was washing over the courthouse steps. Leo stopped and looked at the crowd. He saw the faces of the people his parents had hurt. He saw relief. He saw justice. He took a deep breath of the fresh air. He didn't know what was going to happen next. He didn't know where he would live, or if he would have to go to a new school. But for the first time in his life, the future belonged to him, not to the family name. He wasn't Arthur Henderson's son anymore. He was just Leo, the boy who told the truth. And that was enough. The weeks that followed the explosion of truth in the courtroom felt like a blur to Leo. It was as if the town of Oak Haven had been holding its breath for a decade. Suddenly, everyone let it out at once. The shock waves of that single day, the day Leo placed the silver USB drive on the rail tore through the community. Like a tornado, the big white house on the hill was no longer a symbol of perfection. It became a crime scene. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind where the perfect roses used to grow. Forensic trucks were parked in the circular driveway for days, hauling away boxes of files, computers, and even furniture. The people of Oak Haven didn't drive by slowly to admire the view anymore. They drove by to stare at the wreckage. Neighbors who had once envied the Hendersons now whispered about them over their fences, shaking their heads in disbelief. For the first few days after the trial ended, Leo didn't have to speak to anyone. He was placed in protective custody not for his safety from the public, but to keep him away from the media storm that had descended on the town. Reporters from all over the country were camped out, offering money for exclusive interviews. They wanted the inside story of the boy who brought down a kingpin. But Leo had nothing to say to them. He was tired. Eventually, the circus moved on. The news cycle is fast, and new tragedies always replace the old ones. The cameras packed up and left, looking for the next big story. When the noise finally died down, Leo was moved into a temporary group home for teens. It was a small, modest house on the other side of town, far away from the hill. It didn't have a fountain or a chandelier. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the carpet smelled a bit like disinfectant. But to Leo, it felt safer than the mansion ever had. He had a small room to himself with a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out onto a quiet street. There were no locked doors here, no hidden basements, and no heavy air of secrets. The other kids in the home had their own problems and their own scars. For the first time, Leo didn't feel like an outsider. He wasn't the rich kid anymore. He was just Leo, a boy trying to figure out who he was without the shadow of his parents hanging over him. The legal process continued, but Leo didn't have to be in the center of it. The mountains of evidence from the USB drive made the prosecutor's job easy. The investigation spilled over into City Hall and the police department. Several high-ranking officials resigned in disgrace when it was revealed they had been blackmailed by Arthur. The town of Oak Haven was forced to clean house. And while it was painful and embarrassing for many people, most of them knew it was necessary. The rot had to be cut out so the town could heal. A month later, the sentencing hearing took place. Leo decided to go. He didn't go to support his parents, and he didn't go to watch them suffer. He went to get closure. He needed to see the end of the story with his own two eyes. The courtroom was much quieter this time. There were no cheering crowds or packed galleries. Just a few reporters sketching in their notebooks and a handful of curious locals. Arthur and Eleanor sat at the same table where they had sat during the trial. But they looked like different people. Arthur had lost weight in jail, and his expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. His hair had turned gray, and the confident glow was gone from his eyes. He looked small and defeated. Eleanor sat beside him, staring blankly at the floor. She looked like a ghost of the woman she used to be. The judge read the charges, listing the crimes in a monotone voice. Embezzlement, fraud, extortion, conspiracy. When he got to the sentencing part, the room went silent. "Mr. Henderson," the judge said, looking down over his glasses, "you abused the trust of this town for years. You used your family as a shield to hide your greed. You blackmailed your neighbors and stole from the needy. There is no excuse for your behavior." Arthur stood up. His lawyer had advised him to read a statement apologizing for his actions, hoping to get a lighter sentence. Arthur cleared his throat and looked around the room. He saw Leo sitting in the back, watching him. For a second, their eyes met. Arthur seemed to wince, as if remembering the look of pure hate he had given his son in court. He looked away quickly. "I am sorry," Arthur muttered, reading from the paper, though he didn't sound like he meant it. "I made mistakes. I hope the court can show mercy." The judge did not look moved. "It is the judgment of this court that you serve 25 years in state prison." The gavel banged. Arthur's shoulders slumped. The deputy stepped forward to take him away. He didn't scream or fight this time. He just shuffled toward the door, a broken man. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She stood up, tears streaming down her face. "I did what I was told," she cried. "I was a wife. I just wanted to keep my family together." "The court has heard enough," the judge said. "Mrs. Henderson, you were not a silent partner. Evidence shows you actively managed the illegal funds. You are sentenced to 15 years in state prison." Eleanor collapsed, sobbing into her lawyer's arms. It was a pathetic scene, but Leo felt nothing. No sadness, no joy, no anger. He just felt an immense sense of relief. The monster in his life was finally locked in a cage. He stood up and walked out of the courtroom before the deputies could take his parents away. He didn't look back. Life after the sentencing was a slow climb back to normalcy. Because Arthur had stolen everything, the family's assets were seized by the government. The big house, the cars, the vacation homes, all of it. was sold to pay back the victims. The charity got some of its money back, though not all of it. Leo was left with almost nothing in terms of money, but he was okay with that. Money had been the source of all his misery anyway. A kind man named Mr. Vance, a lawyer who had helped Leo during the investigation, stepped up to help him navigate his new life. He helped Leo get enrolled in a public high school and set up a small trust fund with the little bit of money that was left. Just enough for college. On his first day at the new school, Leo was nervous. He kept his head low, expecting people to recognize him. For a while, some kids did whisper, "That's the Henderson kid," they would say. "His dad is in prison," but teenagers have short attention spans. Soon, the whispers stopped, and Leo became just another student in the hallway. He made a few friends. He joined the robotics club, discovering a love for building things with his hands. Real things. Shady deals or fake businesses. He liked taking things apart and putting them back together, seeing how they worked. It was honest work. No lies, no secrets. 6 months after the trial, Leo went back to the Hill. The big white house was empty now, the lawn overgrown with weeds. A for sale sign stood out front, battered by the wind. He stood on the sidewalk. Looking at the place where he had spent 16 years in fear, he remembered the late-night arguments, the locked drawers, and the feeling of being trapped. He remembered the way the sun used to hit the fountain in the morning, looking beautiful while hiding the darkness inside. He realized then that the house wasn't haunted. It was just a house. The ghosts were his parents, and they were gone. Leo took a deep breath of the cool evening air. He turned around and walked away. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't look back at the life he used to have. He walked toward the bus stop, where the lights of the town were flickering on. Oak Haven was healing. The town wasn't perfect, and people still remembered the scandal, but they were moving forward, and so was Leo. He had a backpack full of homework, a few dollars in his pocket, and a future that belonged entirely to him. It was scary, yes. But as the bus pulled up and the doors hissed open, Leo smiled. For the first time in his life, he was free.